This is CBS News Flash. I'm Dan Lieberman in Washington. In Mexico, a strong earthquake hit the central Pacific coast, killing at least one person in the port city of Manzanillo, Colima, setting off alarms in Mexico City. The magnitude 7.6 quake hit Monday afternoon. Sherry Panini, who faked her own kidnapping in 2016 so she could go back to a former boyfriend, was sentenced to 18 months in prison. She pled guilty last spring after her false report led law enforcement on a 3-week search for 2 Hispanic women she claimed abducted her. And Starbucks announced it's ending COVID-19 additional sick pay for workers beginning October 2nd. Employees will now need to tap into their sick and vacation pay if they have to self-isolate due to COVID. For more news, download the CBS News app on your cell phone or your connected TV. I'm Dan Lieberman, CBS News, Washington.
The government calling it the biggest case of COVID fraud in the country. 47 people in Minnesota charged in a $250 million scheme accused of exploiting a child nutrition program. These folks allegedly were claiming to feed needy kids, but were apparently keeping the money for themselves and showing others how to do the same.
As alleged in these indictments, over a short period of time, these 47 defendants engaged in a brazen scheme of staggering proportions.
Joining us now from Chicago is NBC's Maggie Vespa. And Maggie, federal investigators have minced, as we just heard, 0 words on this front.
Exactly. They're calling this, as you said, one of the biggest COVID fraud schemes ever in the U.S., the biggest, I should say, also calling it just a massive get-rich-quick scheme, fraud. It's being called in Minnesota the Feeding Our Future fraud specifically. And the reason they're calling it that is that Feeding Our Future, they say, is a Minnesota nonprofit that has done work like this for years. But once the COVID pandemic hit and a lot of the restrictions around these federal funds were loosened, they vowed to use this now kind of newly available money to feed needy kids during the pandemic, as we saw at the needs store. People were, out of work and kids were out of school. Well, overall, over the next couple of years, investigators say this group, including one of the heads of that Feeding Our Future agency, got $250 million in federal funds, again, earmarked to feed needy children. But instead of doing that, investigators say they did things like buy houses in Minnesota, buy homes abroad, luxury cars, jewelry, kind of the whole nine. Here's more of what we heard in that press conference earlier.
These individuals believed that they could steal tens of millions of dollars from a federal child nutrition program by claiming to serve food to needy children when they were not. Their goal was to make as much money for themselves as they could while falsely claiming to feed children during the pandemic.
And at that presser today, we heard from the DOJ right there, the FBI, the IRS, even the U.S. Postal Service inspectors who say the mail service was used, so they're in on this. They say the investigation spanned 18 months. And Hallie, right now, we are seeing the results of all that work.
Maggie Vespa live for us on that developing news this afternoon. Maggie, thank you. Tom, let me turn to you here because there had been some discussion, and I'm looking sort of through what we have seen from other reporters in the courtroom as well, right, that the declassification issue, as Vaughn has laid out, had come up, right? And we've talked about this here even just this afternoon. The idea that while the former president and his allies have said publicly he declassified some of this material we're talking about, his attorneys have not said it where it counts, in a court, right, or in court filings. They're refusing to say that. And the judge seemed to have some questions about that piece of it today.
Right. And I think one of the things, based on the various reports we've seen from the Eastern District in-house reporters, Hallie, is that the judge brought up and said, look, this is, as far as I'm concerned, it's not up to me to determine, the judge saying this, it's not up for me to determine whether or not these documents are classified. That's something that's held in the executive branch. I'm in the judicial branch. And so when I look at this, I see that the government has on these documents, it says it's top secret. It says it's top secret with all sorts of markings on it, which indicates it's at some of the highest levels that the U.S. has as far as classification. Who am I to dispute that if you all aren't going to enter enter the fight on this and make your own assertions as to what could be declassified or not. I'm just going to go with it and say it's a classified document because I'm not in a position to argue against it. That seems to be the genesis, and I'm waiting on a transcript. And as I mentioned to you last hour, we weren't able to hear the hearing because of some audio difficulties on the phone with the court. But it appears to be that that's kind of the core of that argument that's presented here. We do anticipate getting a scheduling order perhaps later today, which will provide a little bit more of a tick-tock, Hallie, as far as how are things going to proceed. And, of course, all of this could be controlled by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which still needs to determine whether or not the special master's review of this and more importantly, whether or not federal prosecutors can continue looking at the documents seized from Maralago to determine whether or not there's been any threats to national security and use them in their investigation. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals could come in and kind of Bigfoot this whole process. So still waiting on some of that to be figured out, still waiting on the scheduling order from the special master. But it appears that the trend, at least at this point, and at least based on what we know from the court proceedings so far, this may be further clarified in transcripts, that it appears that the judge is just going to go forward with whatever the government says is classified because that's held outside of the judicial branch. Allie?
Ms. Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian woman from the Kurdish minority, was with her brother in Tehran when she was arrested on the 13th of September for what was perceived to be improper hijab. She fell into a coma shortly after collapsing at Bozara Detention Center. Ms. Amini, who also goes by the Kurdish name Gina, died 3 days later. There are reports that Ms. Amini was beaten on the head with a baton, and her head was banged against the vehicle by so-called morality police. Authorities have stated that she died of natural causes.
MyPillow CEO Mike Lindell must face a defamation lawsuit brought by a voting machine company that he falsely accused of rigging the 2020 election. A federal judge in Minnesota yesterday denied Lindell's motion to dismiss the lawsuit brought by Smartmatic, which operated voting machines in Los Angeles County during the 2020 presidential election. Smartmatic alleges that both Lindell and his company falsely promoted the theory that its machines had been rigged in favor of Joe Biden. According to the judge, there is a wealth of evidence that shows Lindell's claims are false. Lawyers for Lindell put forth that the case is a violation of the First Amendment.
These individuals believed that they could steal tens of millions of dollars from a federal child nutrition program by claiming to serve food to needy children when they were not. Their goal was to make as much money for themselves as they could while falsely claiming to feed children during the pandemic. The defendants obtained over $250 million from the child nutrition program through Feeding Our Future. This money was to be used to feed needy children in Minnesota. Instead, it was used primarily for the benefit of the defendants. And this $250 million is the floor. Our investigation continues. They used this money that was supposed to be used for feeding children to buy houses in Minnesota, resort property and real estate in Kenya and Turkey, luxury cars, commercial property, jewelry, and much more. Even if you are feeding thousands of children, as these defendants claimed, you simply cannot make much money working on this program legitimately. When this program works as it's supposed to, it takes a lot of effort to run it efficiently so that the food gets to children. Here, the defendants primarily pocketed the money for themselves, spending little on food, staff, and logistics. As alleged in the indictments, they didn't have to. They were running a scheme, not a child nutrition program.